everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched some of our content and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today, we're talking with Professor Loretta Feris. Loretta is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Transformation at UCT and a law professor specializing in resource law, pollution law, and international environmental law. She holds numerous degrees, such as an LLB from Stellenbosch University and an LLM from Georgetown University. The professor is a member of numerous organizations, most notably a law commissioner of the World Conservation Union and a member of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Petrus. It's wonderful to join you.
So we've had, I think it's almost common knowledge by now in South Africa that for the past couple of years, we've had a number of almost want to say different protest actions that have turned into addressing some of the serious social issues that we have at our universities, especially with the gigantic divide that exists within South Africa in terms of privileged classes that are able to go to universities and others which are exempt from this for monetary or social reasons. One of the first big ones, the ones that gained traction the most at the start, was known as the RhodesMustFall movement, which centered specifically around UCT, where you're currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. Do you think that there's been a lot of controversy in terms of how that went? Do you think that the RhodesMustFall movement, did it go too far or perhaps not far enough in addressing the issues that it had at its core?
Look, I think, what does too far mean? We need to think a little bit about it. Let me start by saying that student activism is part of our history. It's part of our history as a country. It goes back to the anti-apartheid era. But we also see that worldwide, many revolutionary moments were led by students. So I think students, young people, are always going to be at the forefront of driving change, and we must accept that. And in higher education, I think we've also come to accept it, even though it sometimes makes us deeply uncomfortable. We have to live with that because that is the nature of the beast, so to speak. But if we want to talk about RhodesMustFall in particular, first of all, I need to say that it was less about roads. It was less about a statue. It was about the process of decolonization. It was an important moment for the country and for the world because I think it challenged the ways in which we think about higher education, the way we think about the curriculum, the way we teach, how we understand knowledge, where it is derived from, who owns it. It also challenged our thinking of, and the ways we think about icons of colonialism. And in a way, our blind acceptance of our colonial past. And so I think for these students, decolonialism became a conceptual lens through which they critique the world as they experience it. And of course, in that generation, we've been talking about as the so-called born frees. It's a generation that was born after apartheid. And so those of us that have lived through apartheid have come to understand our history very different to what these students do. They looked around themselves and asked, born free from what? I mean, I can say that, they're born free from apartheid because I lived through it. They didn't. So they don't necessarily understand that historic oppression. But what they do understand is their reality. And their reality is often a reality of deep-seated poverty, of marginalization. And so for them, they don't particularly feel born free. And I think that's, and I think maybe just one more thing to add is that not having been born in apartheid, I think gave them a different kind of freedom. It gave them the freedom to ask questions that goes beyond apartheid, to actually go to our colonial past. And to ask, well, why do we accept the fact that we are still having an education that comes primarily from our colonial past? And so I think that's in essence what these students did is they asked really important questions. And so I think that's why I call it an important moment for us, because we've actually in higher education built on that, not just in South Africa, but in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly formative number of years where the way of thinking and the different perspectives that they're exposed to goes away from perhaps their smaller small town roots and things like that, where they're really exposed to every perspective. But you specifically mentioned that the main perspective that they're exposed to is the education that they're getting in these institutions, which are specifically, like you mentioned, colonialized. Perhaps for our international viewers that don't quite understand the context of what we mean when we say that they're combating or they're fighting for decolonization, because in certain contexts people think, okay, but South African colonization already ended not in 1994 with the recent election, with the first free election, but rather back when South Africa removed its British roots, and even before that when it removed its Dutch roots, for example, in terms of its connections to Europe. So what exactly does colonization mean in terms of the mentality, or how would we explain that to an international student?
Well, I think the way to understand it is this, and that is that countries that were colonized, well, countries like South Africa and other countries around the world, were in essence forced to replace their own ways of being and doing with that of the colonizer. So if you think of our system of governance, if you think of our legal system, for example, we've inherited it from our two colonizers. We have a hybrid system that is based on Roman Dutch law as well as the English common law system. And that is the South African law system, right? And we're an African country, and we can ask ourselves the question, well, what are the kinds of legal systems that have prevailed in South Africa before the colonizers came? Because we don't see that, right? But we know that there was something such as customary law. And how much of that do we still draw upon today? And that is the history of colonization, is that we have embedded ourselves in these systems that comes from our colonizers. You know, I was reading a very interesting article last night about the ongoing conflict in Somalia with Al-Shabaab. And the author of the piece made the point that they have not done enough in Somalia to draw upon age-old systems of governance and conflict resolution, such as asking clan leaders to assist with dispute resolution. And so, you know, so those are examples of what we have lost, you know, as a result of colonization. And so for me, decolonization is not so much of simply saying, well, you know, we want to do away with the English legal system and the Roman Dutch system, but and replace it with a customary law system, because that's not practical. But what we are saying is that we want to learn more about our own ways of doing. We want to understand what that looks like, and we want to infuse our thinking perhaps in more innovative ways by drawing on indigenous systems, indigenous knowledge systems. Mm. And so when we're talking about decolonizing education, that's really what we're trying to do, is to infuse more of what we have, and the innovations that comes from this continent.
Mm-mm. And also, I mean, I want to say it's almost an international perspective, in the sense that through globalization, we're more and more incorporating different cultures and different perspectives in the way that we work, or rather not we work things, but even international communities work the way that they work things. So this is a natural progression in that regard, for people with that perspective. I do want to change that over to the second movement, which I don't want to say came after it, because it was in some ways tied to it, but it also was, I want to say, the larger of all of the social movements of change that we had at universities, which was popularized as the FeesMustFall movement. For the viewers that don't know, these were targeted at university fees that kept increasing with approximately, you know, changed year on year, but approximately 11% per year in terms of tuition fees to account for inflation and other things. But the argument of the students that made was it doesn't only account for inflation, it's actually increasing more than inflation and incorporates a lot of other costs that limits the accessibility. We've had a weird situation this year where education has become, almost want to say, it's removed, it's gone away from its traditional roots in the sense it's become digitized, and you have so much free education available, high quality education available, even on platforms such as YouTube. Do you think that the Fees Must Fall movement, first of all, what was your opinion on the movement in 2016? And also, do you feel like it's still relevant in an age where education is becoming so digitized and more accessible and even free online?
So I think you've made somewhere in there you slipped in the word access, and that was really what the Fees Must Fall movement was all about. It's about gaining access to education, because we must remember that in a South African context, we are sitting with poverty that is really quite vast. And for many people, education is a way out of poverty.
Right.
They see education is that gateway out of poverty. And so of course, the problem is that they can't necessarily afford it, which is then why there was this kind of move towards free education. And maybe just to say, so that was the big thing, was to argue against fee increases. But there was also, some of it was also around getting access to accommodation, especially at UCT. But we can talk about that later. But let me answer your question. I think that digital education, or digitally mediated education, as we call it, does not necessarily equate to accessible education.
Okay.
Because it requires a number of things which poor people don't have. It requires a device, right? So it's not that easy to for somebody, because even if you say you can have it on your phone, well, that's not the best way to actually navigate education. So you need a device, but you also need data. And we know that data in South Africa is extremely expensive. But we found last year, even though, so we provided students with a device, we provided them with laptops. We do that anyway for our first years as we've been doing that for many years, giving first years a laptop. But then we rolled it out to all of our students last year, and we also provided them with access to data. But that didn't even solve the problem, because for many of them, they lived in rural areas where there wasn't access to Wi-Fi.
There's no connectivity.
And the data, it's meaningless, because there's no electricity, for example. Or many of them live in circumstances, socioeconomic circumstances, where, you share a shack with 7 or 8 other people. It's not possible to study. And so we actually made the decision this year to return students to residences. We will still be teaching online, but we want them to be in an environment where they can actually study, where it's conducive for them to study. So I guess what I'm trying to say is digitally mediated education is not a silver bullet, not in the South African context. So I think residential universities still has a role to play. And then, of course, the other important point to make is that certain areas of education makes itself more easier, so you can maybe do an economics degree online or a law degree. But what we need scientists, and we need artists, and these people do need a residential experience. You need to have access to labs, because we need to research, things like COVID. And you need your artists, so they need access to studios, etc., etc. So there will always be a role for residential universities, but I do think we now learned that there's also a role for digitally mediated education. I think our challenge is how to make it accessible and meaningful in the country.
Out of personal curiosity, because my university that I attended last year moved quite strongly towards hybridization, or rather they have been moving towards it for a couple of years. And now obviously they were forced into it. They didn't really have a choice. And the concept of hybridization is this type of ideal scenario where you could use the advantages and the scalability of digital education and then combine that with the labs and the studios that the artists and scientists need. Do you also feel like this might be too much of an idealistic perspective that you can combine this, or do you think that this is just something that will take time to implement?
Look, the wonderful thing about COVID is that it actually propelled us forward into the digitally mediated space, because obviously we've also for years been talking about, you know, digitally mediated education, and there was always this, but what about this, but what about that, you know, so, and then we didn't have a choice, and then we didn't, right? So I think that's the wonderful thing, and I don't think we're going to go back. I think we're going to keep on, and a hybrid approach is the approach that we're going to take going forward. And we're going to be forced to anyway, because I think COVID is going to be with us for the next 2-3 years. So
this is actually a great segue point to your portfolio at UCT specifically, which is transformation. With regards to, you know, obviously the technical issues of and practical issues of digitizing and going towards a hybrid platform, but also the social issues, as you've now explained. Could you briefly describe what the UCT's transformation plan is, and how do you seek to rectify the social issues?
Yeah, so transformation, at least my view of transformation, is that it's not an event, right? So transformation, maybe also just for your international viewers, we're talking in a South African context, we're talking about diversity and inclusion.
Right.
So it's not an event, it's a process, and that process is very much informed by its context. So I stepped in this role in 2017, and that was kind of fresh out of the FeesMustFall protest, and actually we still had some protest at UCT in 2017. But the protest was around access, as you said, to university. It was about fees, it was about access to accommodation, and those and mental health. Those were the 3 major issues in 2017. And so that's where we focused our attention, because in order for students to be part of UCT, to really have the UCT experience, they need to know that they are financially secure. They needed to know that they have accommodation, and we needed to deal with the very real mental health issues that young people across the world are battling. But having come out of 3 years of protest was very much a problem at UCT. So it is almost the kind of bread and butter issues. From there, we've moved on. We're looking at broader issues such as language. We're looking at the naming of buildings, because, you know, you need to look around yourself and see yourself, you know. We're looking at staff transformation so that we have a more diverse body of staff that teaches students, and we've made some strides in there. And then we're looking at issues such as gender-based violence, racism. You know, all of these, I think, speaks to what is the kind of culture that you have at a university. And yeah, that's very much work in progress, but it's work that we are steadily, you know, addressing through policy change, through education, through, you know, yeah, all kinds of interventions.
It's also important, as it was the next topic that we were to move on to, that you mentioned gender-based violence. I want to say that this is one of the serious issues that perhaps caught more of the attention last year than of the other ones, although I do very much agree that all of these issues are continuously addressed and is in a process for with it. Specifically, gender-based violence in terms of how it was addressed in the different universities. Some universities took a hardline stance against, for example, the one want to say binge drinking culture that exists that comes with the freedom of being a student and young and not having a care in the world. You know, they addressed it through that way, whereas others looked at the culture between genders and seeing, you know, how do that specific scenario there in almost want to say not encourage, but, you know, lead towards gender-based violence. With it being such a complex issue, and you mentioned policy changes, do you feel like policy changes are enough to change this, or do you think it's a cultural situation that you can change by, you know, educating your students? Or what exactly is, when it's such a complex issue, from what angles do you attack it?
From all of them.
Right. You know, in the ideal sense.
Yeah, it's such a massive problem that you have to attack it from all areas. Because, you know, I think, first of all, one needs to take a hardline approach. I fundamentally believe in accountability for gender-based violence. I believe that perpetrators must account for their actions. So in terms of policy change, we've just last year, at the end of last year, changed our policy on sexual and gender-based violence. And what we have done in one of the major changes is that we have set up a special tribunal that deals with gender-based violence. So previously, gender-based violence cases were dealt with in the way that all other disciplinary matters are dealt with. You know, staff disciplinary matters, it would go through a staff disciplinary process. For students, it would go through the normal student disciplinary tribunal. But we've come to realize that what is required is that you need people with special skills to understand the manifestation or the ways in which gender-based violence manifests, so that those people are sort of, you know, chairing these kinds of tribunal, because they understand the manner and like I said, the ways in which it works. So we've set up the special tribunal through policy change, and we're really hoping that that's going to address gender-based violence in much more concrete ways. And to some extent, we've already been dealing with it, because we started it out as an ad hoc tribunal towards the end of 2019, because we had quite a big backlog of cases. And we wanted to speed up these cases. So the tribunal was moved to my office, and it's been running for about a year now. And we've seen some, you know, we've gotten rid of the backlog. And I think it's working quite well. And I hope it will be a model for other universities as well. But I think you also need to work with perpetrators, and it's about responsibility. And perpetrators need to take responsibility for their action, but they also need to understand, you know, what it is that they're doing. And so there's an important role for education there, you know, educating perpetrators, and we do that through my office, but we'll also educate men, because you know, data shows that it's
statistically
that perpetrate gender-based violence against women. And then we also believe that men need to take responsibility, right? So men need to educate each other, you know. So you as Petrus need to stand up and say, I have to call out people when they, you know, my fellow males, when they perpetrate harassment or when they're bullying somebody sexually. You know, it's about stepping out, but you may not necessarily know how to do that. So we run workshops with male students, helping them to understand, you know, how can I step up as what we call a bystander? You know, how can I do this in a kind of a sensitive and dignified way? And then the third area where I think one needs to work with this is to support survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. I think we underestimate the extent of the trauma when you've been violated in this manner. And so we do a lot of that work. In fact, we've now appointed somebody who's a social worker who just do that kind of work, support the survivors of gender-based violence.
I just want to hit on an important point there, because I feel like this is one that's probably the most debated about when it comes to gender-based violence and how it's being addressed, at least especially from my perspective as a male. It's sometimes seen that, you know, they're being targeted and identified as potential gender-based violence, perpetrators, even though they might not have any history of it, or they feel like it, and then they feel like they're being attacked. In that sense, do you perhaps feel that with educating males and creating this environment in which they can realize what their actions mean, is there how do you manage that line between how people feel that, you know, they've never partaken in any of it and they've never transgressed in any way, and now they feel like they have this inherent guilt just by who and what they are? How do you address that situation to not then turn them almost against the situation out of principle, saying like, hey, you say I'm a criminal, but I've never done any of this stuff. Now I'm going to, you know, rebel against it. So how do you constructively address that issue without labeling them before any accusation has been done?
So look, I think one of the ways that one does this is to actually get people to become activists, to become activists against gender-based violence. And we ran a campaign in early 2019,
Right.
where we asked, we did these little videos where we asked men to just step up and let them speak about gender-based violence. So almost sort of, we want to partner with you and not see you as a prospective sexual offender. And that's really I think it's one way of dealing with something which I think that you're raising, which is very valid. And understandable, right? We human. We become defensive, and we sometimes feel that there's a need to be defensive. So it's about, how does one turn that mindset around? Which is, join me, become a gender activist with me. Join me in speaking out against gender-based violence.
Yeah, including them in discussion and not excluding them goes a really far way in terms of feeling respected in the way that you're not seen as a potential perpetrator, but rather as this is a problem of society as a whole. And then it's most practical to address the statistical issues first before you try a nice broad approach where nobody feels like they're being targeted. It is important to look at the statistics in terms of how you handle things. I just want to move on from that point in terms of the legal system. You mentioned the tribunal that you now have specifically for such a personal and sensitive issue as gender-based violence. Some people, in terms of how, you usually take an example of one thing that's being done, and then you take it, like you extend it in terms of to the extreme by symbolizing then what this way of thinking can lead to. And a lot of people feel like, okay, so now there's a tribunal for gender-based violence. Okay, that means there'll have to be a tribunal now for racism issues, which is actually, might not even be a bad idea in terms of addressing that as also a very personal thing. And then say, okay, then tomorrow there will be one for, the next thing, which might be sensible, until it gets to a point where you're addressing, how people should be classified. And then you have a tribunal for that. You have this extension of a legal system that feels like it could get out of control. So in terms of my question there, are you worried about the increasingly interventionist approach in the legal system that we have? Today the judges might be on our side, but tomorrow they might have a tribunal for something that we didn't originally agree to or plan for. How do you feel about that situation? I think the classical quote is, "Who will guard the gods?" So forth.
Yeah. So look, it's not a good question to ask a lawyer, because as a lawyer, I will always say, you need judges, right? I will always be on the side of the law and the need for the law to intervene. But maybe to qualm some of the fears is to say that the judiciary can only adjudicate on issues that are legislated, right? On issues that are part of policy or that we've made into legislation. And so, as if we, and I say we the people, obviously, because we elect our legislators, if we decide that there's an area that requires adjudication, we put it into law, and then of course any kind of dispute has to be adjudicated by the judges. Of course, in most countries there's a kind of a checks and balances system, in the sense that the judges don't appoint themselves. And I think that's quite an important way to ensure that judges are objective and that they are neutral. I mean, it was very interesting to see that even where in a country such as the US, where the President Trump, the previous president,
yes,
appointed judges who he thought was going to be sympathetic to him. How they overturned all of these challenges against the elections. And that is because I think fundamentally judges are trained. We are trained to understand that the law comes first, as opposed to our own opinion. And another good example is during the Zuma years, right, which is probably our countries in a post-apartheid context, our darkest years. Right. We could still rely on the court system, right? So, and I think that would give us hope, is that we have a system where judges do not appoint themselves; they're appointed by the president. Well, in South African context, there's actually a Judicial Services Commission that makes the recommendation to the president, and it's quite a rigorous process. If you follow those interviews, it's something that actually looks quite horrendous, and it's very transparent, and the whole world literally can watch this process. So I think it's quite a scary process. But and you being asked questions, right, about that is quite intrusive. Yeah. And I think that really, I think at a personal level, it must be very difficult, but at least it gives us transparency. So yeah, so that's my view. And maybe just to say this about specialist courts, we're not going to find specialist courts for everything, but even if we do, they still have to adhere to the basic rules of adjudication, so to speak. So the fact that you are a specialist doesn't mean that you are biased, because you can still be taken on review, and your decision can still be taken on appeal to, for example, to the Constitutional Court. And that's another way in which we make sure that judges remain objective and, they don't use their own personal view. So, that's why you do find specialist courts, because you bring in the special expertise, but they still need to adhere to the rules of fairness.
Yeah, but in a practical sense, you'd also hope that the most qualified people are addressing the issue anyway. So special courts are actually in interest of the people that are being assessed under whichever allegations exist. I also want to transition it to your experience and background in environmental law and pollution law. Some might say that this is a completely different angle to the transformation discussion that we now had, but it's also incredibly important issues that a lot of students and activists and young people probably or statistically feel the most passionate about. So in terms of climate change, we see that as a topic specifically being discussed in a lot of political circles. Actually, I just want to say on the previous point as well, it's also very important that when you say that judges are legislating the law, then in essence, the law are the ones that the people vote for. So people should go and vote if they're worried about this type of stuff, because their votes are what will count in terms of what judges legislate. But anyway, sorry, that's just the thought I had. It's important to go and vote. So sorry, back to the opinion on climate change. This is also something people specifically vote on, go for candidates that stand for the issues that they care about, and climate change are one of them. What exactly in terms of your experience in environmental law is your opinion on climate change, and are we doing enough to stop it? Because the statistics in some regards look really damning and like kind of hopeless, but what else should be done if we're not doing enough?
Yeah, so it's a huge problem, and I don't think people really understand the extent to which climate change is already changing the world. And the way we live, and the impact that it has, and the potential impact that it can have on our livelihoods, on our health, on infrastructure. I think we came close in 2018 when we have this massive drought in all over the country, really, but we felt it particularly here in Cape Town, and we came
where we're used to the rain,
not having water. Yeah. And it's directly related to climate change, because we know, and the scientists can show us how increasingly our summers, our winters are becoming drier, and when we do have storms, they tend to be more severe. And so we changed our behavior for that small moment, that Cape Townians were facing the drought. But I think that's the big challenge is how do we change behavior when we actually don't feel it that immediately, right? Because people talk about climate change, but it still feels like it's something out there. It's not something that is real. And I feel even perhaps more despair about the extent to which we can make a change in carbon emissions, having seen people's behavior during COVID. Right. And I'm asking myself, if people are literally dying and we're still not willing to change our behavior, what is it going to take? And so there's a part of me that really, really despair. when I look at social behavior, because I think climate change requires us all to pitch in. We all need to take it serious, and we all need to change our day-to-day behavior. And then, of course, there's the bigger changes needs to happen, in the sense that every country needs to take it serious, needs to have the necessary plans in place, right, to reduce carbon emissions, so that we can actually meet the targets that we've set ourselves, as a world, ourselves.
Yeah, it's important that you said that every country needs to be part of it, because climate change doesn't really end with a particular border. It doesn't really care about our political borders, in a sense. But it's the reason why I highlight that is there are certain countries where on the one side of the border people are quite conscious about it, on the other side of the border they couldn't care less. Specifically in terms of the Paris Climate Agreement, we had a situation in 2016 after the previous president Trump withdrew the US, such a big and important economic and industrial powerhouse of the world, from the Paris Climate Agreement. Do you feel that do you feel the issue was specifically with his policy mentalities, or do you feel like there perhaps could be some issues where the Paris Climate Conference doesn't deal with the problem directly enough, or perhaps should take a different angle, which brings everyone under the umbrella of solving this issue?
Well, I think the Paris Agreement has actually already done that. Okay. Because actually there's something like, just under 200 countries that are now members to the agreement. So it's basically almost every nation on earth, right, that has signed on to the agreement. And the majority of those have, because you can sign an agreement and then not make it part of your national laws. But the majority of countries have actually done that. They have solidified this support for this agreement through a formal approach of some nature or another. And so that does give me, that does give one a sense of hope. I would suggest that at least this is one agreement where you have commitments from all of the major carbon emitting countries to cut their emissions. Whether they will do that, we don't know. I mean, they still have some time under the Paris Agreement. And of course, now that the US is, as of today, Biden indicated that it's on his to-do list for today.
Yeah, to sign back up.
Is to sign back up. But actually, interestingly enough, Trump, who was of course a climate change denier, so I mean, one is not surprised that he withdrew the US, but he indicated his intent to withdraw. What was it, 2017, 2018? I can't remember. But he wasn't able to do that immediately, because in terms of the agreement, it actually binds you for a particular time, and he could only effectively withdraw the US in 2020, late 2020. So it actually means it's a very short withdrawal, because as we know, Biden is going to rejoin. And I think the other important thing to say about the US, which has probably saved us in terms from a climate change perspective, is that many states, because it's a federal system, many states have taken their own climate change actions, and they didn't necessarily rely on the fact that the US indicated its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And so through their own state-based plans, they continue to cut emissions within their states. So, I don't think we're in such he could have messed up more, but he didn't actually in reality.
Yeah. And it's also, you can't go away from any type of policy change, one quite as big as that, and one that has such a big economic change, without, almost want to say, predictably, people will try and take advantage of this in some way. Some businesses will start up to try and make use of the funding, the state funding that comes from it. The state, buys shares in certain companies and that advance this agreement. There's a lot of involvement there between state and business. And this is one of the issues that have been most debated about among people that are moderates on the subject is like, yes, we need to solve this issue. Yes, sure, this is a big deal, but perhaps they don't feel the gravity thereof. So then they're threatened by how involved the state is getting in the businesses and the advantage that some people take from the situation. So do you believe, or sorry, rather, let me ask this way: what entity do you think will be able to solve this issue? Do you think the state needs to be more involved in these solutions, pressing I want to say the urgency of solving the issue, or do you feel like private enterprise will make use of that in of its own way, and the state should rather allow the market to follow the people's need, which is according to what they voted for in the 200 and I think it's 220. Sorry, it's 200 countries that have signed up to this. So people will then buy to go green. Do you think that'd be the natural progression?
Yeah, so it's 197 countries that have signed up to it, but it's quite significant, right?
Yeah.
I think this is one area where we absolutely need to allow the market to take hands with government and look. We need to look for some from public-private approaches that will make this real. I think in some yes, my view. So I think. We're seeing much more innovation in the market, because the reality is people are beginning to see ways in which they can make money, from either climate change mitigation or from adaptation. But let's create the regulatory framework that allows for private entities to come in, right? And we can create a regulatory framework that will ensure that, because I think governments want to make sure that there's parity, that you don't have a situation where poor people in particular are cut out of the deal.
Right.
But I think you can create a regulatory framework for that. And I think South Africa is a really good example of where we're not doing that, where we can take advantage, for example, from the fact, if you look at our power situation, of private entities supplying power into the grid. Make that possible. We can still have a regulatory framework that ensures that poor people get access to electricity. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that's why we're making really a big mistake when it comes to the way in which we're managing power, and in particular in the ways we are managing renewable energy, is that we're not allowing private entities and private people like me. We're not allowing somebody like me to install a solar system on my roof and to feed it into the grid.
That's actually an important point as well, because I mean, if you just take a drive, especially through the Capetonian, the Western Cape area and the Capetonian, almost want to say more privileged environments, you see a lot of these big homes that people have solar panels on them, and they have batteries on them because it's just such a schlep to feed it back to the grid, so they just store it and then use it for their own purposes, which is a natural progression with a situation like lockdown, with load shedding, that people want to solve the problem themselves. They're like, okay, the government's going to do it, fine, I'll do it myself. But the problem is this obviously has a huge monetary barrier to it. To this day, I don't exactly know of a system in South Africa, because we've done a lot of research about this. I don't exactly know of a system in South Africa that's actually profitable in terms of running a solar system in your home. Like it'll be profitable, but in a ridiculous amount of time, like 20 years. And by that point, you have to replace the batteries. Right, exactly. Yeah. So there's not a really attractive, there might be a solution, but there's not really attractive, sensible, profitable environment for individuals to solve the power situation. So this could also be a class divide then, sorry?
No, I was saying there's no incentive. There's no incentive for somebody like me to invest. And so I'll invest in a gas stove because that's cheaper, than putting solar on my,
Whereas if you could actually harness this capital that certain communities are willing to spend and then feed them back into the grid for them to supply to the people that can't afford it, that'll actually be a more interesting environment. And so you feel like regulation could perhaps just in that regard allow more of that to happen? Or do you feel like private large power generation enterprises is a better way to go perhaps?
Well, I think we need to allow for a mixture. We need to allow for, and that's, if you look at some of the countries that are really successful, and by the way, one doesn't have to go to Europe. We can actually look at some of the countries on the continent that are really successful. They're allowing for those hybrid approaches where you have your big government energy providers, going into private partnership arrangement, public-private partnerships with companies. And then I don't know whether on the continent you can, there's systems where private citizens are feeding into the grid. I think that's more of a European model, but I think that's something we need to investigate. And I know that I haven't been following it closely because I simply don't have the time really for my discipline these days. But I know that the Western Cape would like to diversify the energy pool in this way. And they're being prevented by national government, and I know that there's an ongoing court case in this to this effect, which I really hope that they're successful, because I think we really need to begin to look at how do we diversify the pool so that we can also subsidize people that can't afford.
And then last but most definitely not least, we have a situation where I think it was the beginning of last year, I think in April or perhaps March even, you had some of these photos floating around on the internet in different communities where when they've had to go into lockdown because of the worldwide pandemic, the environment the climate actually thrived. Where there was less silt, for example, in the rivers of Venice, for example, or the clear skies above India, where you can see all the way to Himalayas. This is I know from my perspective, at least, it was such a beautiful thing to see. It's like, oh my word, look, the world can heal given the chance. But this came at, almost want to say, a very great cost, where people were, by state mandated to stay in their homes and reduce the amount of consumption that they have, which is obviously not a natural environment for people to be in. And so my question there is, what exactly is your opinion on the lawfulness and the practicality of lockdown? This was specifically to solve the issues of the amount of deaths that's rising due to COVID, but also perhaps, in situations like environmental concerns, mandating certain things that people are not allowed to do in order for the environment to survive. What do you feel about the lawfulness and practicality thereof?
Yeah, so I think this is a complicated one. It's a complex one. I think that lockdowns has become, in a way, a necessary tool for governments, because we're not very complicit as human beings. I think that's the struggle that governments have, and so I don't think these lockdowns have always been particularly rational. But I do want to spare a thought for the fact that these regulations are almost developed overnight. And so when one compare lawmaking processes under normal circumstances, you would develop law, you would consult broadly, you would get different views. And so, I would be coming with the law and Petrus will tell me, but have you thought about this? And I would think, I haven't thought about this. So actually I need to go back to the drawing board. Now we're making laws, overnight almost. And so we don't think of all of the possible implications. So that's the kind of sympathy that I feel for government. But then at the same time, I don't have a lot of sympathy when something like the smoking ban, when we see it's not working as a regulatory tool, when the science doesn't really support us, why do we keep on harping at it? Why did it take us? So why did we, keep on putting that smoking ban when it didn't yield results? So I think that's really, I think lockdown as a whole, obviously it's necessary because, like I said, we're not compliant by nature. But I think it hasn't always been rational. And I think it really requires government to sometimes just step back and say, okay, this isn't working. So we need to reassess. But of course, so there's currently about, I think, 120 or something legal cases or has been since lockdown against government. So they've certainly had their reality check. But it's the same in other countries, right? In the UK, there's also a whole bunch of legal challenges. And so that's well, if anything, it's an interesting time to be a lawyer, I would say. Because, yeah, there are these very interesting challenges. And the most recent one, of course, is the liquor ban. And SAB is taking, and once again, it's not a very easy one, because people are losing their livelihoods. But at the same time, I speak to some of my colleagues who work at RhodesMustFall, and they say, thank you, Lord, for having that liquor ban, because all of a sudden I can work on my COVID patients, and I don't have to deal with the car accidents that come as a result of drunken driving, or the stabbings and the shootings and gender-based violence. And
it's actually interesting, because I think it was New Year's. There was this amazing article that came out with a photo of a hospital, which I can't remember the name of now. Well, yes, where every year past over New Year's, their ER would be full of situations where people partied way too hard, drank way too much, and then led that to gender-based violence, to assaults, to car accidents and everything. Whereas now it was just empty. Where if you see something like that, for the common person, anybody has to understand, okay, this has an effect. But seeing the balance between how livelihoods are being absolutely destroyed, where people, maybe not in a car accident, but equally damaging to their life in terms of their livelihood, is an incredibly difficult situation to talk about and to sort out. I think the frustration from a non-law perspective, from a citizen perspective, might be that these laws, like you said, are being made overnight, whereas the legal actions that are being taken against government are like, okay, the court date's set in 2 months, and meanwhile the government just continues doing what it wants. So that situation is quite a bit more difficult. The regular law process is being followed, but the lawmaking process isn't, or regulations rather, is not being followed. How do you see that being balanced in terms of future pandemics and situations that we have? Sorry, it's ad hoc, but I think it's an important question.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think one can only learn. One must learn from experience, and I'm hoping that lawmakers do, and I think they have, right? So we back into level 4, but we're level 3. But we see that it's not the same level 3 that we've been in before, right? And so there's a lot more scope for economic activity, and that says to me that our lawmakers have learned a little bit. Okay. They've looked at what is causing massive economic harm to people, and how do we? And so I think the only really major restriction is the alcohol restriction, and it pretty much government is allowing us to kind of live our lives, and economic activity is continuing, and it's now up to us to be responsible, right? And so
it goes both ways.
Yeah, it goes both ways, exactly.
But we want to thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your worldview with us. I want to give you a last opportunity to add anything or plug anything you'd like to.
No, nothing really. I mean, maybe just to appeal to people to be actually, to be responsible, to act responsible. I think, we were just this morning talking about a third wave, and I was thinking, good Lord, we still sort of, we're in the midst of a second wave, it's become really, really scary, I think, in South Africa to see so many people dying. And so I think we need to become responsible, or remain responsible, those of us that are responsible. And so that would be my end word. But it was lovely talking to you. Thanks, Peter.
We thank you so much. It's been absolutely insightful. It's so great seeing a balanced and moderate perspective that should be advanced in terms of what we're really being talked about, instead of snappy, quick judgments. I feel like people think that those happen all the time, but really in the background, a lot of good, moderate, solid things thinking is going on. It's important to highlight that as well. So we want to thank you so much for talking to Professor Loretta Feris today. This has been, for our viewers, this has been WorldView. If you've made it this far, you most definitely enjoyed the video. So please consider liking the video. It helps out the channel quite a lot. And also donating on Patreon. It's a platform that supports our endeavors financially, allows us to get more equipment, get more people, go places, stuff like that. That'd also be amazing. So we thank you so much again for watching. This has been WorldView.